The desert night split open with the crack of a gunshot, echoing across the barren plain where silence had ruled for hours. James held his revolver steady, breath sharp, eyes locked on the shadows moving between the sagging wooden buildings. His heart pounded, as if it wanted out of his chest, but his hand never wavered. Beside him, Thomas whispered that death rode close tonight, and every man had to choose his side before dawn broke. Samuel sat on the porch, the lantern glow revealing a face hardened by years and scarred by mistakes, and his voice was steady when he said, "Wisdom costs blood, but blood spent without purpose leaves only ghosts." The dirt road lay empty for a moment, then boots scraped, spurs clinking, a figure stepping forward with a sneer that caught the lantern light. James cursed under his breath, torn between running and fighting, but Samuel leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, and said that fear was only a chain. Thomas swallowed hard, clutching the rifle, his youth trembling against the weight of a night carved in violence. The stillness returned for a breath, and then came the second gunshot, louder, closer, final. Dawn broke across the desert, spilling red light over the empty town where silence still carried the weight of the night's gunfire. James stood near the trough, rinsing blood from his hands, though none of it was his own. His jaw was tight, eyes hollow, as Thomas asked what came next, his voice cracking with fear. Samuel emerged from the porch, leaning on his cane, his words sharp as he reminded them that running never solved what chased them. James muttered that ghosts followed faster than men, and Samuel nodded, his weathered face calm in the morning light. The dust swirled as a stray wind cut between the buildings, lifting scraps of paper along the wooden planks. Thomas stared at the revolver on James' hip, the young man's hands twitching with both fear and curiosity. James finally said that survival was no gift, it was a burden carved in scars. Samuel replied that scars carried lessons, and without lessons, men were doomed to repeat their sins until the desert claimed them whole. The morning stretched long, the heat rising quick, baking the town under a harsh sky that spared no one. Samuel sat on a step, his cane resting across his lap, voice steady as he told Thomas that courage was not found in bullets, but in patience. Thomas shifted uneasily, his young face marked by doubt, muttering that patience had never stopped a man's death. James leaned against the railing, eyes distant, voice low as he said that death came either way, but how a man met it carved his legacy. Samuel chuckled dryly, saying that wisdom often came too late, and fools wore it like borrowed clothes. The creak of a sign in the wind was the only sound as the three sat in silence, each haunted by what the day might demand. James finally pushed away from the railing, telling them the desert held no pity, only choices that cut deeper with time. The sound of hooves shattered the quiet iron striking earth, in a rhythm that carried menace with each beat. A rider appeared at the edge of town, coat black as the night, badge gleaming on his chest. Richard slowed his horse, gaze cold as he surveyed the street, and his lips curled in a smile that never reached his eyes. James stiffened at the sight, muttering that the law had come not for justice but for blood. Thomas whispered if they should run, but Samuel's hand gripped his cane, voice low as he said that running only fattened the wolves. Richard dismounted with slow precision, dust lifting around his boots, his hand resting near the revolver at his hip. He called out that the town was his now, his authority written in iron, and anyone who opposed him would learn the cost of defiance. The townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the echo of Richard's voice, their eyes wide with fear. James stepped forward, his boots grinding the dirt, revolver heavy at his side, but his voice steady as he demanded to know Richard's claim. Richard smirked, replying that order had a price, and he was the man to collect it. Thomas clenched his fists, muttering that men like Richard thrived on fear, and Samuel nodded grimly, saying fear was a currency too many spent without thought. The crowd murmured, uncertain, their faces caught between hope and dread. Richard raised his hand, signaling silence, his shadow long in the rising sun, and declared that this was the beginning, not the end. James' eyes narrowed, his silence more dangerous than words, as the air thickened with the weight of choices yet to be made. James watched the town wake under a bruised sky, the color of old wounds, and said, redemption is never free. Thomas stared at the dust and asked if redemption ever lasts. Samuel answered that it lasts as long as a man keeps paying. A church bell clanged once and died in the wind, like a warning forgetting its words. Richard's riders flickered on the horizon, black shapes crawling closer with the heat. James said, "He wants our fear first, then our obedience." Thomas asked how to refuse both without dying. Samuel tapped his cane and told them that dying was easy, but living honest was the work. A shutter banged, and a whisper of prayer slipped through a doorway before the door snapped shut. James felt the night's gunshot echo in his bones, a debt still unpaid. Samuel said that wisdom lives in the space between anger and patience. Oh! Thomas breathed in the heat and decided patience had sharp teeth. Behind the saloon, Thomas asked if a man could start over when his name was already stained. James said that a name is only loud if you keep repeating it. Samuel advised them to let actions speak and let time write the rest. A stray dog nosed at a thrown deck of cards, scattered like prophecies nobody wanted. Thomas said, "Richard owns the day," and James answered that night still belongs to memory. Samuel told them memory can be a lantern if you raise it high enough. The wind dragged a heat shimmer over the yard, bending light like truth under a badge. James checked his revolver and said, "Habit keeps hands alive." Thomas flinched at the click, then grinned at his own fear. Samuel smiled thinly and said, "Fear is honest, but it does not have to be boss." The bell of a spurred boot cut their talk, and quiet became a blade. She arrived with the noon glare, silver earrings catching fire in the light, and the street forgot to breathe. Evelyn stepped down from a coach, eyes unreadable, and said she sought water and quiet. James told her quiet was expensive here. Thomas stared, caught between awe and worry, while Samuel's gaze measured the truth behind her poise. Evelyn asked who kept the peace, and Richard answered from the doorway, saying the badge did. James shifted, and the air turned brittle. Evelyn thanked Richard with a smile that meant many things and none at all. Samuel said under his breath that storms often arrive wearing perfume. Thomas asked if storms ever choose a side. James replied that storms only choose a direction. The noon sun hammered nails of light into every shadow, and the town braced for whatever her presence would cost. Richard led Evelyn to the shade, voice smooth as oil, telling her the town prospered under firm hands. James heard the word prosper and tasted iron. Thomas asked Samuel if charm could hide a noose. "Samuel," said, "charm is the knot, not the rope." Evelyn sipped water and asked about last night's gunfire. Richard said disorder had been corrected. James said correction without truth was only theater. Richard smiled and asked if James preferred chaos. Thomas stepped forward, then stopped when Samuel's cane nudged his boot. Evelyn watched the exchange like a dealer weighing cards, eyes bright, pulse hidden. Richard adjusted his badge and told the crowd that safety would be enforced. The word enforced landed hard, and shutters pinched shut. James said safety without choice is a cage, and even the flies went silent. Dusk crept in with violet edges, and the town exhaled like a body after a punch. Samuel gathered James and Thomas behind the livery and spoke low. He said the badge would squeeze them until all that remained was compliance or rebellion. James asked which buys fewer graves. Samuel answered that both pay dearly, but only one keeps a man's name intact. Thomas said he was tired of feeling small, and James told him small men can cast long shadows at sunset. Evelyn appeared at the corner, soft steps, a question in her eyes. She warned that Richard planned a curfew and a search by moonrise. James thanked her, surprised by the risk in her voice. Samuel nodded, saying debt sometimes begins with a warning. The first star pierced the sky, and the night felt like a page about to turn. The sun fell hard on the street as Richard's men rode in, rifles gleaming, and the town shrank into doorways. James stood firm in the dust, his revolver heavy, and whispered that fear was now the law. Thomas asked if they had a chance against so many, his voice cracking with youth. Samuel replied that chance was less than courage, but men still clung to both. Richard dismounted, boots striking like hammers, and announced that loyalty would be weighed by silence. Evelyn stood near the well, her eyes searching James' face, half warning, half plea. James said no law could demand silence when truth was rotting in plain sight. Richard smiled and lifted his hand, and his men cocked their rifles in unison. Samuel's cane struck the ground, a sound small yet steady, and he told Richard that steel may rule, but wisdom still endures. The street held its breath as dust swirled between boots and barrels. Thomas slipped away behind the stables, his hands shaking as he loaded his rifle, muttering that courage could not wait. James caught him, anger flashing as he asked if youth thought itself bulletproof. Thomas said, fear was worse than bullets, and tonight he would prove his worth. Samuel's voice cut through, calm and sharp, warning that pride had buried more men than bullets ever could. James clenched his jaw and told Thomas that courage was not rushing forward, but standing when retreat was easier. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes wet but defiant, saying he was tired of shadows. Samuel leaned on his cane, sighing that shadows often save a man's skin when the sun burns too hot. The horses outside stamped restlessly, sensing storms that words could not calm. James finally gripped Thomas's shoulder, softer now, telling him that time makes men, not single moments of defiance. The saloon filled with uneasy murmurs as Evelyn entered, her steps slow, every gaze following. She asked James if he believed Richard could be broken by defiance alone. James replied that steel breaks steel, but hearts break men. Richard lounged at a table, whiskey in hand, his smile sharp as a blade. He told Evelyn that loyalty bought survival, and her debts were already counted. Evelyn's lips curled in a faint smile, but her eyes shifted toward James like a secret message. Samuel muttered that a woman torn between sides carries more danger than comfort. Thomas whispered that maybe she was hope, but James said hope was the cruelest dealer in this town. Evelyn raised her glass, toasting to survival, though her hand trembled as if caught between two choices. The piano struck a sour note, echoing like a warning across the crowded silence. James walked alone by the corral, stars faint above the last light of day, his breath slow and heavy. He remembered graves unmarked and promises broken, each step echoing the weight of his past. Samuel approached, voice soft but steady, reminding him that scars only matter when they chain the heart. James said scars are chains that bite deeper with time. Samuel told him wisdom is knowing when to let them bleed and when to bind them. James stared into the corral, the horses restless, their eyes glinting like memories too wild to tame. He whispered that vengeance whispers louder than reason. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, saying vengeance is a fire that burns its own home first. James closed his eyes, and silence pressed down like a stone, broken only by the restless snorts of horses waiting for the storm. Night fell fast, shadows thick, and Richard's men struck like wolves. Gunfire erupted near the livery, sparks tearing through the dark. James pulled Thomas into cover, shouting that survival now meant cunning, not bravery. Thomas fired wild, the shot shattering a lantern, and flames licked the wall. Evelyn darted through smoke, her face pale but eyes fierce, urging them toward escape. Samuel struggled against the push of the crowd, his cane swinging at any man who threatened. Richard's voice roared over the chaos, promising death for defiance. James gritted his teeth and fired back, dust and smoke swallowing faces in the blur. Horses screamed, the air burning with fire and powder, and the town cracked open under violence. The night carried no mercy, only choices made in the thunder of bullets. Smoke crawled across the alley as the fire dimmed, leaving the night raw and tasting of ash. James dragged Samuel behind a trough and hissed that the wound was shallow but mean. Samuel breathed through his teeth and said pain was a tutor that never gave holidays. Thomas knelt close, hands shaking, saying he could stitch if courage could hold his fingers steady. Evelyn pressed a clean rag to the wound and told them the patrols were circling like buzzards. James said the town would wake under a new leash if they failed tonight. Samuel gripped James' wrist and warned that rage ties knots doctors cannot cut. Thomas whispered that he feared being useless more than he feared dying. Evelyn said useless was a lie men told when they forgot to listen. A bell clanged once in the dark, and hooves answered, iron on stone. James met Samuel's gaze and promised to spend every bullet only on truth. Morning carved hard lines across the street as Richard stood on the porch and read his laws. He said curfew would bite at sundown and every home would open its doors on demand. James watched from shadow and said power loves daylight because it thinks truth fears it. Thomas asked what truth could do against rifles and lists. Samuel answered that truth lasts longer than any list written in fear. Evelyn lingered near the step, face calm, voice soft as she asked who guarded the gods. Richard smiled and claimed the badge did, and the badge needed obedience like breath. James muttered that breath taken by force is still a theft. The crowd shrank with the rhythm of his voice, as if pulled by a rope. Samuel tapped his cane once, a small drum against dread. The desert wind lifted the decree and slapped it flat against the door. By the chapel fence, James stared at weathered crosses and said the ground remembers more than men do. Samuel eased down on a rail and told him grief is heavy but can be shaped. James said he could not tell if his anger was a tool or a trap. Samuel answered that anger is a river and the banks are a man's choices. Thomas stood apart, listening, his face set like wet clay waiting for the kiln. James said Richard had turned law into a blade, and he was tired of bleeding. Samuel nodded and said a blade can be blunted by refusal and honed by patience. A crow hopped across a headstone and clicked its beak like a nail in a lid. Evelyn arrived with a folded note, eyes urgent, saying a shipment of rifles would pass at dusk. James tucked the note away and said fate had offered a hinge. Thomas slipped out alone toward the ridge where the trail bent, whispering that boldness would buy them time. James caught up, breath hard, anger sharp, asking if pride now led their plans. Thomas said he could stage a rock slide and break the convoy before dusk. Samuel arrived slower, cane tapping, saying rocks fall on the innocent as quick as the guilty. Evelyn sketched the curve of the saddle and marked where dust would rise. James said a mistake would bury them deeper than any grave. Thomas swallowed and said he would carry the blame if it failed. Samuel told him, blame is cheap while loss is dear. The wind pushed grit across their boots like a fuse burning sideways. James set his jaw and agreed to the trap, but only with hands steady and hearts colder than fear. Dusk bled into indigo as wagons rolled, wheels whispering, and the first signal flashed from the arroyo. James raised his hand, and the team moved like a held breath. Thomas cut the rope, and stones thundered down, scattering riders in a burst of dust. Richard's shout cracked across the gap, furious and clear even in the din. Evelyn fired from cover, neat and spare, dropping a sentry before he could sound the horn. Samuel called for retreat, saying victory tastes bitter when it demands too much. James grabbed a rifle crate as the smoke thickened, teeth clenched against the weight. Thomas stumbled, then rose, eyes bright with shock and relief. Hooves pounded, close and angry, and the ravine roared like a forge. James signaled withdrawal, the night swallowing them as if it had been waiting. The night settled heavy as James unlatched the crate, finding not rifles but chains and shackles, stacked like secrets. He muttered, that betrayal smells like iron, sharp and final. Samuel steadied himself on the crate, saying trust often bleeds faster than wounds. Thomas stammered that Evelyn had guided them to this trap, his voice breaking between anger and disbelief. Evelyn stepped from the shadows, her eyes wet but voice steady, confessing that Richard held her brother's life as a bond. James' hand tightened on the revolver, fury warring with pity in his gaze. Samuel told him that mercy weighs more than bullets, but James' silence cut deeper than gunfire. Evelyn said she had no choice, yet her trembling showed the choice haunted her. Thomas spat that trust once broken is harder to mend than bone. Samuel whispered that sometimes betrayal carries more truth than loyalty. At dawn, the town square filled as Richard read from a parchment, voice smooth but cutting, declaring curfews, taxes, and hangings for dissent. James muttered that law had become theater, staged with fear as the curtain. Samuel leaned against the well, saying theater is dangerous when the crowd forgets it is a play. Thomas gripped his rifle and asked if courage could outshout law. Evelyn stood near the steps, pale but present, her eyes begging James for belief. Richard smiled, raising his badge like a crown, saying obedience was the price of peace. James replied that peace earned by silence is nothing but chains on the soul. The crowd murmured, torn between dread and defiance. Samuel's cane tapped once, echoing like a gavel on stone. Richard sneered and told them wisdom dies faster than men, but James' eyes burned with the opposite truth. Inside the saloon, Evelyn leaned close to James and whispered that Richard planned to move supplies through the canyon by night. James asked if this was another lie, his tone hard as stone. Evelyn swore her words now carried only debt, not deceit. Samuel warned that truth is often too late to heal betrayal. Thomas said they needed to act, even if it meant trusting broken glass to cut the right throat. James stared at Evelyn, seeing both chains and courage in her eyes, and muttered that trust is a coin rarely spent twice. She answered that sometimes coins return heavier than when given. Samuel sighed that wisdom comes slower than regret. James finally nodded, saying they would strike, but if her words faltered, death would ride with them all. The saloon doors creaked, and silence dropped heavy as dust. Samuel gathered James and Thomas by the stable, saying wisdom may falter but lessons never die. He told them his days were near their dusk, but their path was just burning into morning. James argued that death had no timing worth trusting. Samuel gripped his arm firmly, saying choice carries more weight than breath. Thomas's eyes filled, asking if a man could still learn when the teacher is fading. Samuel smiled faintly, telling him wisdom lingers longer than flesh. Evelyn approached, saying the canyon would be unguarded for an hour, her voice urgent but heavy with risk. James said they would act not for vengeance but for the name of freedom. Adapao all to you relieved, of Duria Wasad, it a roared stay. Samuel's gaze softened, and he whispered, that freedom carries a price that only the living can spend. The wind rose, carrying the dry smell of fate across the yard. The canyon path glowed under moonlight as James led the group forward, rifle strapped and eyes sharp. Thomas whispered that the silence felt wrong, too deep, too still. Evelyn kept close, her breath fast, saying Richard's men would be near. Samuel followed slower, his cane tapping steady, each step a metronome against the silence. From the ridge above, a whistle sliced the night, and gunfire thundered. James cursed, realizing the betrayal was double, and Richard's trap had been waiting. Evelyn shouted that she had been followed, her face torn with panic and guilt. Samuel shoved Thomas down and took the first shot in his shoulder, grunting but standing. James roared that the fight had begun, firing into the ridge as sparks flared against the rock. The canyon swallowed their echoes, turning night into chaos. Night thinned into a bruised dawn as James set rifles along the windows and barred the doors with planks. Thomas said the town looked smaller when death was counting houses. Samuel told him towns only shrink when courage forgets its boots. Evelyn arrived with a satchel of cartridges and said the alley would funnel riders if the gates held. James nodded and said the street would be their anvil and grit their hammer. Samuel smiled faintly and warned that hammers also shatter bones. Thomas asked if fear ever learns manners. Samuel replied that fear bows to discipline and nothing else. A crow wheeled over the square and cawed like a cracked bell. James said the plan was simple, and simple plans bleed slowest. Evelyn touched his arm and whispered that Richard would bring the badge and the cannon of reputation. Samuel breathed in the cold and said, reputation dies the first time, truth speaks loudly. They gathered behind the bar where the mirror held 4 faces and 100 regrets. Thomas said he feared missing his shot more than dying. James answered that breath controls bullets and purpose controls breath. Samuel rested his hand on Thomas's shoulder and said, "Precision is the quiet heart of courage." Evelyn wrapped a bandage on Samuel's arm and told him she would not let the night claim him yet. Samuel chuckled and said, "Night collects debts at its own pace." James checked the chamber and said, "No one fires angry." Thomas nodded, swallowing the heat in his throat. Evelyn looked at James and asked if forgiveness had a place when iron spoke. James said, "Forgiveness waits in the silence after the last shot." Samuel lifted his chin and declared that today would teach or bury, and either way wisdom would walk out with someone. The mirror trembled as hooves neared. Evelyn crossed the street alone, dress whipping in the wind, and called to Richard that the town would bend no more. Richard smiled thinly and said, "Bending was mercy compared to breaking." James watched from the doorway, every muscle waiting for betrayal to blink. Thomas whispered that her steps sounded like a verdict. Samuel murmured that verdicts need juries, and today the jury carried rifles. Evelyn told Richard his ledgers were lies and his peace a ledger entry. Richard raised his badge and said, "The badge is the only book that matters." James said, "Books burn, but memory keeps reading." Richard ordered his men forward, but Evelyn stepped between barrels and shouted that the first bullet through her would stain the badge forever. Silence iced the street. Samuel said, "Courage sometimes borrows the enemy's stage and steals the show." Richard's hand twitched toward his holster, and the morning snapped tight. The first shot cracked the air, and the street erupted like dry tinder. James swept left and dropped a rider as the horse reared screaming. Thomas fired from the balcony, breath slow, and another rifle answered with splinters. Samuel called ranges and timing, his voice a steady drum in the storm. Evelyn dragged a fallen crate to shield the door and reloaded with hands that would not shake. Richard strode through smoke, shouting that obedience could still be bought. James answered with iron and silence. Glass shattered, dust rose, and the world narrowed to angles and seconds. Thomas took a graze and bit back a cry. Samuel stepped into the doorway and barked a count, and the team moved as one, a hinge swinging. Richard pointed at Samuel and ordered the line to press. The street felt like a furnace swallowing names. A shot found Samuel, deep and mean, and time lurched as he sank against the post. James caught him before the dust did, saying the lines still held. Samuel smiled, thin but stubborn, and said lines hold when hearts agree. Richard leveled his revolver, but Thomas's answer drove him back 2 steps. Evelyn knelt, pressing cloth that darkened too fast, whispering that the town needed him. Samuel told her the town needed itself, and that lesson had finally learned a voice. James said the fight was not done. Samuel's eyes warmed like coals, and he said wisdom does not die, it changes riders. He pressed James's hand and told Thomas to keep his breath slow and his promises slower. The street roared distant as if from another world. Samuel exhaled, a soft gate closing, and the noise folded into a hush that felt like prayer. Then James stood. The square lay broken, smoke drifting like torn banners, and silence heavier than iron. James stood in the ruins, blood on his hands that was not his own. Thomas said. The town looked smaller without Samuel's voice holding it tall. Evelyn whispered that freedom had been bought, but the price carved deep. James muttered that victory always leaves its own kind of scars. The people crept from doorways, faces hollow yet glimmering with something close to hope. Richard's body was carried away by the dawn wind, his badge lost in dust. James said the town would heal if they remembered every cost, not just every triumph. The air smelled of fire, blood, and beginnings. By the chapel, Thomas asked James if men ever stop burying teachers. James said no, but teachers live on when lessons refuse to die. Evelyn placed a flower near the fence, her face softer than the night before. Samuel's absence filled the yard louder than bells. James told Thomas wisdom walks longest when carried by the young, not the weary. Thomas nodded, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes sharper. Evelyn said silence can be holy when it honors the right voices. The crow from days before perched on the fence, watching like a witness. James whispered that the earth remembers more than stone ever can. The street slowly filled with townsfolk, faces raw but alive. James spoke of rebuilding not from wood, but from trust. Thomas listened, his hands resting steady on the rifle, now slung across his back. Evelyn said the town would remember Samuel, not for the years he carried but for the wisdom he left. James told them scars would not vanish, but scars guide hands stronger than untouched skin. Children peeked from behind skirts, watching with wide eyes. An old man muttered that fear no longer owned the square. James nodded, saying fear dies only when memory refuses its chains. The crowd held still, breathing together like a single chest. That night, Evelyn sat by the saloon window, lantern glow soft on her face, whispering that she never thought redemption would feel so quiet. James answered, that quiet often comes only after storms scream themselves empty. Thomas joined them, his young face sharper now, saying storms also plant seeds. James looked at him and said Samuel's lessons had not died. They had simply found new voices. Evelyn touched the glass, eyes distant, and said freedom is not final but a habit that must be practiced. James poured a single drink, raising it to the silence, and Thomas mirrored him. The night was calm, yet beneath it hummed the echo of battles won and battles waiting. At sunrise, James saddled his horse, the horizon burning with orange fire. Thomas asked if he would stay. James said the town had its keeper now, and wisdom had chosen a new rider. Evelyn stood at the gate, her face unreadable but her eyes carrying gratitude. James told her redemption is not a gift, but a road walked step by step. He adjusted his hat and said Samuel's voice would ride with him, not behind but beside. Thomas called out that he would keep breathing slow and promises slower. James nodded, mounted, and rode into the growing light. The town faded behind him, but Samuel's words echoed louder than spurs. Wisdom, James thought, dies harder than men.